I have the honor to present today Dr. Aaron Cayer, an architectural historian at Cat Poly, Pomona, and the author of a book called Incorporating Architects, How American Architecture Became the Practice of Empire from U.S. Press. Cayer studies how firms, contract, and corporate structures shape what gets built, where, and most importantly, by whom. He delves into how professional practice itself as a political force, sometimes overlooked. Taking a clue for Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition, in 1958, she insists how meaningful life depends on plural actions and speeches. So what happened when we manage and procurement replace civic debates in making cities and landscape, of course, architecture as well, by tracing budgets, delivery models, and labor, showing the method itself. Cayer opens the question of how design fields participate in broader system of powers and how we may act within them more knowledgeably. So please welcome everybody, Dr. Cayer. Thank you for joining, and I'm so honored to be your host.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful introduction. I'm truly excited to be here and to have spent the whole day with many of you, seeing great student work, having amazing conversations. Many of your graduates have become some of my closest friends over the years and sources of inspiration. So it's nice to see where it all started for so many people that I deeply admire. I also recognize how rare it is, I think, to have a talk about books or history in a lecture series at an architecture school, so I'm especially grateful that you are all here, especially given the circumstances of today. I understand it's a very hectic and complex day. So I will do my best to save some time for conversation at the end, and will also try my best to keep us all awake as we spend the hour together. I know it's been a long day. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about this book that I've just finished, and which Cami mentioned, about architecture firms and the state of practice within our profession. But before sharing some brief stories from the book, I thought I would begin by sharing a little bit about how and why I became interested in studying architecture firms and the architecture and engineering firm today known as AECOM. Like many young students hoping to become an architect, I entered college in 2007 from a town where there were no architects, and with the impression that architects impacted the world primarily with the creativity of their designs and their drawings. So in design school, we were reading books about architects and the profession from the 1980s. An archaic period, I think, for many of you here. And we were learning that architects earned relatively low wages, that large firms were few and unremarkable, and that a good professional architect was one who sheltered her work from political and economic life. So stay away from politics, stay away from the economy, just focus on design and drawing. And so when I moved to Los Angeles in 2012, I began to study how architects worked and how they actually created and designed their businesses. And I remember walking through downtown LA for the first time, and I was looking up at all of the tall towers and reading the business names that were fixed to the tops of the towers. And one of the names stood out to me. So I read Union Bank, US Bank, Citibank, City National Bank, and then AECOM. What was AECOM? I had no idea. The firm, it turns out, was a Fortune 500 architecture and engineering corporation with more money, more revenue than any other publicly traded company in LA at the time. It was rivaled only by Disney next door in Burbank. So for some scale comparisons, the firm itself held more capital than 97 countries worldwide, It rented offices in as many nations as the UN, and with nearly 100,000 employees, more people worked there than lived in 98% of American cities. And so I began tracing the history of the A in AECOM, which stood for architecture. First, as it was scaling the office tower, hoisted from a truck bed to the top of the tower as a postmodern sign. And I began to wonder, how had this A become so big, yet so quietly embedded in a sea of financial institutions? Who were the architects? What did they do there? And how had their definition of architecture come to be? So AECOM listed 28 services across nearly 50, quote, subsidiary firms on its website at the time. Architecture and design, IT and cybersecurity, finance, strategy plus. What didn't the company do? I kept asking myself over and over again. And what did these terms even mean? Were all large architecture and engineering firms similar? And did they have services like them? So in one division of the firm, architects had recently designed a new headquarters for the LA Police Department. In a second division, architects were helping to train Afghans for combat. In yet another, architects were writing legal code as part of a new master plan for Kigali in Rwanda. So how and why were architects involved in these radically different muscles of colonial governance that seem to hark back to the founding architects of the country? So I'm thinking like Thomas Jefferson. Were they influencing or changing the role of the architect or the profession across the US more broadly? So these were the questions that I started with, and that really motivated the research that is in the book. And without getting too much into the details today, it turns out that AECOM was the product of another architecture firm that formed in 1946, immediately following World War II, by very young architects named Philip Daniel, Arthur Mann, and Kenneth Johnson. And they later added their trusted engineer, Irv Mendenhall, to form a firm that was named DMJM. They call them DimJim. And in the book, I described how DimJim history really parallels many architecture firms that we know today over the span of the 20th century, from Albert Kahn's firm to Leo Daly, closer to home, Gensler, Perkins and Will, and on and on. The firm's first two founders, Philip Daniel and Ken Johnson, were both architecture students who graduated from the University of Southern California in 1937. But it wasn't until they were serving in World War II that, so they were about 7 years out of architecture school, that they had this idea to start their own firm together. They kind of wanted to start a firm together while they were in school, but it didn't really occur to them until they were at war. And so their ships happened to meet on the tiny island of Saipan. And they met up, and according to them, they got a little high on torpedo juice, which torpedo juice was the popular Navy cocktail that you got when you mixed grain alcohol for torpedoes with pineapple juice. So they mixed that all up, and they got high, and they said, this is when they decided, hey, what a great idea it would be to form an architecture firm together. I'm not encouraging this, but just to say. But the firm did not have immediate success. Imagine starting your own firm not long after graduating, right? So in its first 3 years, the founding architects were focused only on the designing of school buildings during the post-war boom. They thought it would be great to just focus on one particular building type. However, they were nearly bankrupt. They were taking turns in the hospital because they all had stress-induced stomach ulcers. They were blaming each other for the firm's inability to make a profit. And so here is one example of some of their notes from a business retreat where they were kind of blaming each other for the firm's inability to make a profit. And they were describing the problems that they had with each other. So it reads, Art Man, stubborn, impatient. Ken, ruthless with incompetent people. Irv, gets too close to a few employees. And so in 1950, they called in the experts. They hired a management consulting firm named Booz Allen and Hamilton, which still plays an active role in government today, to help them organize financial and gain financial traction. So the leading consultant recommended two things informed by their own consulting work for the US military during the war. And so first, like military branches, that architects shouldn't only be focused on school buildings during economically unstable moments, that they should diversify their project types from schools to infrastructure to military projects and office towers and soon international development projects. And second, that they should become a corporation rather than a partnership, which is what they had formed when they started. So taking this advice, they leaned on their wartime friends and their friendships from their military service, and they sent a bunch of letters to anyone in positions of power, and here are just a few of those examples, between Dim Jim's founders and commanders in the Navy, the Air Force, even the White House, and US ambassadors. So they just sent letters to anyone who would listen. Please give us work. Please give us a project. So it worked. They procured military projects both in the US and abroad during the late 50s and early 60s, oftentimes without having any experience doing these things, including the designing of top secret military bases in Vietnam, in South Korea, in Japan, in Guam, that were used as infrastructures of war from which bombers would take off, often to destroy entire communities out of sight from the US. As well as underground ballistic missile prototypes here in the US, in space launch facilities such as those at Cape Canaveral during the Cold War. And I know that the history of these missiles remain sort of central to our thinking here in the landscape in Nebraska, but I'm including this rendering of one missile here on the right, which is one of my favorites. It was shopped out to a classmate of theirs, another architect who they had gone to school with at USC. His name was Jack Martin Smith. And Jack Martin Smith had previously rendered the stage sets for The Wizard of Oz. And so really this serves as a testament to the kind of emerging military industrial entertainment complex in Los Angeles, and also the wide scope of work in which architects were engaged in. So I think sometimes once you look carefully at these side by side, it's difficult not to see Emerald City as a kind of series of missiles all clustered together in this way. And interestingly enough, set design was actually built into the architecture curriculum at the time. So here were some architecture students that were featured in an LA Times article about their training in set design and costume design for the Hollywood industry and for film. So the classmates of Daniel and Johnson's included architecture fraternity mate Hilliard Brown, who worked on Citizen Kane and later Cleopatra. Henry Bumstead, who was known for his work designing To Kill a Mockingbird and The Sting, among many, many others. So if you're interested in a career in set design, in Hollywood production, architecture is still for you in this regard. But then it should come as no surprise, given this engagement with the ballooning military and entertainment industries, to learn that they opened offices around the world during the 1950s and 1960s, with Los Angeles remaining as their headquarters among about 70 other cities across the US and 33 internationally, from Abu Dhabi to Lima, Saigon to Seoul, Cairo to Caracas, as you can sort of see here. But after this wartime work and after wartime destruction and this work designing military bases, came reconstruction and rebuilding. Really this cycle that scholars like Naomi Klein describe as disaster capitalism. So beyond their projects at home, they procured large international development projects with so-called cost-plus contracts with the USAID that they learned had higher profit margins and terms in their contracts that allowed for the exploiting of local laborers through overtime abroad much easier than here at home. And so among the many dozens of projects, these included the design and construction of a highway in Sudan, ports and harbors and in Indonesia, and electrical grids and water infrastructure in Thailand. So in this one particular and super fascinating report on how to extract water on the Korat Plateau in Thailand, they describe sedimentary conglomerate, which is rock that's comprised of various fragments, as excellent for development, in their words, because of its inherent porosity. So they could really pull the water out of the ground. Yet these concepts of extraction, porosity, defense, and development also paralleled and were informed by their ideas about business and their firm itself. So they really thought about the firm itself as a design. So in business, they filed their articles of incorporation in 1952. They created a bunch of business manuals and organization charts, such as this one here, to help structure their growth. And I won't bore you with all of the details as I do with my students about these, but it's really in these kinds of diagrams about business and the organization of people that were then informing the businesses, the buildings that they were producing. So the executives were breaking from the kind of traditional labor of design work and starting to engage in other forms of administrative and marketing work, just at the same time as curtain walls were being sort of separated from the structural components or the structural systems of buildings themselves. So what's happening in the firm and business and organization is paralleled in design and the building itself. So at the time, the government was, with some exceptions, only allowing very large architecture firms and architects who were working on defense and development projects to be corporations, because they were working on risky projects, and then they deserved some greater legal protections in the eyes of the government. So architects were supposed to work as sole proprietors or partnerships, not as corporations, because, as the courts argued, architects had individual licenses, and therefore you, as an individual with an individual license, you had an intimate bond with, an intimate relationship with your client, like a lawyer or a doctor, right? So how could you maintain that level of trust if you were working as part of a group with only one licensed professional, the courts were asking. So imagine if you went to the doctor and there was like a team, right? And only one was a licensed doctor, right? So this was the question that the courts were asking. How could the public trust you if you're working as a group with maybe only one licensed person? But lawsuit by lawsuit, including one in California that I describe at length in the book, the courts argued that architecture was different from law and medicine, and that architects who worked in groups could indeed incorporate their businesses. So slowly by surely this started to change, and 25 states formed laws of incorporation by 1969 that took advantage of new tax benefits and potentials for profiting with corporations. So surpassing partnerships and proprietorships to nearly 60% of architecture firms had adopted corporate structures by 1982. And this is really a trend that continued into the 21st century, as 80% of architecture firms were incorporated by 2012. So corporations really became synonymous with higher profit, state alliances, secrecy, as well as internationalization. And while today it's true that 90% of all architecture firms in the US still operate with less than 20 people, only 1% of all firms have more than 100 people. So we're really talking about a small fraction of firms. Over the same span of time, those large firms have begun to dominate our field in terms of billings. to nearly 40% of all of the buildings in the US. This was by 1997, and it continues to expand. So in other words, there was and remains increasing competition for work among smaller firms, with larger firms and corporations dominating government work in particular. And so in terms of revenue, you can see that if we compare the 1970s to 2017, which is the moment of the most recent economic census, the average employee size really hasn't changed that much. There's about 4 people per firm, and a little over 200 on average in large firms. But if we look at the revenue per person, we can see some changes. So small firms used to bring in more money. So you'd bring in more money per person than larger firms. But small firms now bring in about the same as they did proportionally, but large firms have far surpassed that, you can see, at $231,000 per person compared to $158 then. Yet, once a corporation meets the kind of limit of capital expansion, what happens? So once you've expanded into many, many, many cities and you've filled up all of your offices, the corporate charters, not unlike the codes of international development and military expansion that they were engaging in and writing, specified that you could acquire other companies to diversify. And so as new expertise was needed, entire companies and their assets were acquired rather than just hiring up 1 or 2 people. So it's in this series of interrelated contradictions and shifts from internal growth to external acquisition, from defense to development, and from incorporation to conglomeration that I argue links the history of 20th century architecture to the history of imperialism, right? So if we think about acquisitions, what are we talking about? We're talking about the acquisitions of land, of bodies, of businesses, which signal a most extreme version of capital accumulation. So you expand, and then when you're at your limit, you start to acquire other people and other lands. So by 1970s, DimGym had acquired and merged with a diverse array of other firms. Then they describe themselves as a professional conglomerate, a firm as a portfolio, marrying the terms of business with the terms of art and architecture. In other words, a porous infrastructure through which people and firms could pass. And so here you can see a list of firms that were swallowed up or merged with or developed by DimGym and later AECOM since the 1950s. So a kind of growing family tree. And every time I blink, I have to kind of update this diagram here. And finally, back home in Los Angeles, they created aesthetic theories around concepts for their clients that had, like them, become multinational corporate conglomerates. So they hired well-respected architects like Cesar Pelli and Anthony Lumsden. They also won numerous design awards with projects that peppered Los Angeles and the country, including a laboratory for the semiconductor conglomerate Teledyne, which was built in Northridge, California, which is one of my favorites because you can see just how clearly the business chart itself was transposed onto the ground as the floor plan. So you take the diagram of the company, the organization chart, those boring things that we don't like to look at, transpose it onto the ground, and this becomes the building, which they thought could expand in all these directions, because what happens if the company acquires other companies? We'll never know how many companies are going to acquire, how big the building needs to be. So if we create this structure like this, and they call these fingers that could grow in all different directions, it can expand infinitely. So this super interesting conglomerate building that they described. And so for those of you who have taken or are taking professional practice, I think professional practice in this way is also still a design, right? Like you're thinking about organizing business and structuring business in this way. They also had urban infrastructure projects like the Tillman wastewater reclamation plant just north of LA, another favorite. This is on the left. Since architects were turning smelly sewer treatment processes into public architecture and winning awards. For those of you that are fans of Star Trek, this was used as the backdrop to Star Trek. And it's just such a fascinating building. Every time I visit there are like weddings happening there, and there's this incredible Japanese garden. But if you hold your nose, it's kind of a nice place to be, but it's a little smelly as the sewers is being processed behind you. And this structure on the right is Manufacturers Bank, which is part of their collection of mirror glass office buildings that they designed. And they were really trying to work to come up with curvilinear forms with glass itself. So these became really important sort of instigators in postmodern form and postmodern discourse. But quickly, what were some of those kind of subsidiary businesses or other firms that were operating within DimGym? Well, first, one of the early subsidiary corporations was called Logicomp, and its offshoot Design Methods. Both of these were early data processing and computer companies that they had in-house and that were embedded in their firm. So using their military contracts and the clearances that came with those contracts, they had access to military computers before most architects did, including the powerful UNIVAC 1108 and 9300. The 9300 are depicted here on the left. When I first saw these, I thought these were washing machines. I was like, wow. Why do they have washing machines in their lobby? But no, those are computers. And the UNIVAC 1108 was much, much bigger, and it cost $2.3 million at the time, just for one computer. And they were using this for development studies and also to compute the plans also of other architecture firms in their offices. So this is a diagram that they produced for another architect's office, Welton Beckett, another large firm. And they were using the computer to help them figure out where things should go in the office, where the administrative suite should be relevant to, or should it be next to the drafting folks? Should it be next to the secretary office? And trying to think about diagramming adjacencies in that way, but based on distances and calculating those distances. A second subsidiary was called DimGym Aerial and Associates. So they acquired a military plane, as most architects do, an A-26 bomber from World War II, and they used the so-called Huron equipment, which was equipment for navigating bombers, to survey, quote, undeveloped and unknown parts of the world, including in Africa and South America. And so with all of their many subsidiaries within this expanding corporate conglomeration, from real estate to construction management to surveillance to even cosmic X-rays, they started to think about the urban economy itself as the site for the architect. So the city was like the firm in their view, and it was comprised of social, economic, political, and physical subsystems. Yet they defined architecture as only a part of the physical attributes of the city, not at all touching the political or economic components, and as a direct opposite to non-material social and cultural so-called subsystems. But when we take into account the broader range of practices and the expanded scope of work in which architects were actively engaged through subsidiaries and affiliated companies, the field of architecture was indeed much, much broader. And so really the growth of practice went hand in hand with the process of urbanization. And of course, this urbanization is echoed in the urban concentration of architects that has continued to intensify. And you can see here in this Bureau of Labor Statistics map where architects currently work and where they do not work. There was, on average, one architect per 10,000 people in the United States in the 1850s, 2 architects per 10,000 people in the 1950s, and now there are nearly 8 architects per 10,000 people, which I think really begs this question about, is our profession saturated? Is our urban economy saturated? or oversaturated, right? How many architects do we need? Do we have too many architects? Not enough? Where are they going? What are they doing? As well as its correlations perhaps with unchecked development, right? Do we just continue to develop and expand? Or perhaps unchecked university admissions, right? I understand we're in a university, but thinking really about universities as businesses in the same way, right? Like as my former dean used to say, butts and seats was the number, how he referred to students, right? Like how many butts and seats, money, right? So this, I think, trajectory, importantly, is not matched by other professions, right? This continuous oversaturation, and especially the ratio of 8 to 10,000 people. So if we flash forward to more recent days to help us understand or think about this question about maybe what architecture had become, I think we can turn to the words of corporate leaders for hints that echo the history that we've just covered. So AECOM's vice president argued in 2010 that, quote, "We are AECOM. We can do anything." Up the street at Gensler, another architect more recently suggested that their architecture is, quote, "what we say it is." Or even Bjarke Ingels at Big, who has argued that, quote, "architecture must become worldcraft." So if we understand architecture or the work of architects to be anything at these corporate firms, I think we have to ask ourselves, why is it that the expansionary rhetoric sometimes echoes those of our professional associations? So I'm thinking about the AIA, for example, or even our universities, right? Expansion, expansion, excellence, 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 development, right? Well, it turns out that large architecture corporations like DimJim had gripped the reins of the profession and lobbied the government for policies that would suit the expansionary needs of their large firms. And while there were many, I think, very positive unintended consequences of these new large firms and their complex bureaucracies, including a disproportionate number of women who were finally entering the profession through these large corporate firms before it was considered acceptable at smaller firms. Many were hired first as secretaries and then as records managers, such as Carol Ann Bakeman, who was my favorite photograph, I think, records manager and librarian, hired on the left, or several architects, including Zelma Wilson or Kim Day or Ellen Wright, who went on to lead their own award-winning careers and firms. Many stories of them describing how they first got to the office. One of the first women architects who was hired started, on her first day, and one of the senior partners said, "Okay, can you go get me a coffee?" She said, "Excuse me, I didn't graduate with my master's degree in architecture to be waiting on you and getting your coffee. You have to go ask someone else." So there was just an assumption, right? All of these embedded biases about what women should be doing in the firm, and it didn't look like architecture. But that fortunately started to change. At the same time, however, beginning in the mid-1950s, AIA presidents were more commonly leaders of large corporate firms. So Chet Lane Gogler Nolan, Perkins and Will, RTKL, HOK, and on. So they started to really shape the direction of the AIA. And one of the first things that they changed was the AIA's handbook, which was until the 1960s, a single-bound volume that was published in the 1920s for the first time, that George Johnston argues helped the architects to really assemble their profession in a book, a single-bound book. By the 1960s, though, this handbook was renamed, and it was no longer a single volume. Instead, it was a multi-volume, 3-ring binder, a portfolio, in the words of the inventor of the 3-ring binder, a disassembled book of 20 leaflets known as circulars that could be swapped out or updated or expanded. So really a profession sort of disassembled, open to expansion in the same way that the firm was considered a conglomerate, right? Firms could come and go in the same way that a piece of this handbook could come and go, right? All in the name of expansion. A second impact on the profession was in the ethics code of the AIA, which was radically redefined by corporate leaders in the late 1960s. So beginning in 1909, the Code of Ethics of the American Institute of Architects tried to protect the market position and to guard what it was that an architect did. So it was established to be an architect meant that, or to be a professional meant that architects could not engage in price competition with each other. So you couldn't compete with each other based on your prices, right? That was considered unprofessional. And you also could only engage in the designing of buildings, right? So as a professional architect, only designing buildings, that's it, right? No construction, no real estate, no design build, no development, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this was 1909 until something changed, right? And as most scholars of this period suggest, it was President Nixon and later Reagan's governments who forced the AIA in the 1970s to encourage competition and to adopt a broad definition of architect. However, in fact, the leaders of corporate firms were actively encouraging these changes. So California and New York's AIA presidents argued in 1969 that, quote, "We should welcome such efforts of those of large corporate conglomerates to increase the scope of the architect's service." And the AIA circulated drafts of a new code of ethics later that year in 1969, 2 years before the DOJ even formally sanctioned the AIA. So these corporate leaders had this in mind. They were really trying to expand the definition of architecture and to make architects compete with each other on the basis of price, right? You offer cheaper services, maybe I'll hire you, or you're gonna offer cheaper services, then I'll hire you, right? But how, I'm sure you're all wondering, right? Did they nudge the government to enforce and uphold these ideas, these neoliberal ideas, right? How did they get, let's say, Nixon and Nixon's administration to uphold some of these expansionary rhetorics? Well, here are the words of the president of the AIA National in 1971, Robert Hastings, who was a former president of the large architecture and engineering firm Smith, Hinchman, and Grills. "The architect today and the institute he directs must now plunge actively into political life, enlist allies, swing votes, mobilize community action, and take positions on issues that once were thought to be outside our rightful area of concern." So in effect, Hastings' advocacy for political interference was challenging the profession's long-standing mechanisms of social control in order to set themselves free after they had been built up by government projects, right? So they had been built up, and then they were like, oh, we want to keep expanding, so we're going to get maybe the government to allow us to offer different services and cheaper wages or competitive wages. It's no surprise then that we find a flurry of lawsuits such as this one in 1978, launched by the state of Massachusetts against several architecture firms, including DimJim, for quid pro quos. So they found a network of architecture firms awarded billions of government dollars worth of contracts in the late 1960s, such as for the construction of the Holyoke Community College, in exchange for campaign contributions for the Republican Party trying to re-elect Nixon. So for those of you thinking about health and safety, the court ultimately concluded that, quote, "The state designer selection board system was manipulated by design firms that were knowledgeable about state bureaucracy. And their buildings were often shoddily constructed," this is a quote, "shoddily constructed because they were built too rapidly and had dangerous structural defects." So here again, politics was undermining the ethical code of the profession and the legal argument for licensure, right, to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So they're advocating for regulation through the AIA, but at the same time kind of undermining it through their practice. or separately, classified letters in the Watergate scandal materials revealing how architecture firms like Dim Jim were actually driving the scandal. So the administrative chair of the Republican National Committee that was trying to elect Nixon was an architect and vice president of Dim Jim. And he was responsible for appointing James McCord, who was a former CIA officer, as head of security for Nixon to let people in and spy, right? And he was the first person to be indicted. Or here, a final photograph, and one of my favorites, of Dim Jim architects in 1982, sipping beer and vodka sodas with Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, Michael Deaver, at the Bohemian Grove in Northern California. The Bohemian Grove is an all-exclusive, all-men club that meets in the summers off the record, and it still does to this day. And it's comprised of presidents from all over the world, CEOs, and professors. And it's also where Oppenheimer first discussed the atomic bomb. So this place where they're always off record to discuss important things, right, about the world. So if we turn now to our present, I think we can see the physical impacts of AECOM and firms like it on our buildings and built environment all around us. And indeed, it's often in the making of the most physically unremarkable buildings, so the plants, the airports, the highways, and offices, where we have found that AECOM, and perhaps the architecture profession itself, has its most politically remarkable acts. And yet the firm still seems to be hiding in plain sight, right? Firms like it, poorly understood by the general public and long unnoticed by architects, students, and scholars. But this is also by design. So their work hides through vast infrastructural networks, and the architects and engineers write themselves out of official records, hiding behind the names of design architects, who we like to focus on, and through this avoiding scrutiny and accountability as anonymous corporate abstractions. But I think we also have to be aware of our own disciplinary and professional biases. This is just one example of how people are written out of these official records. This is a document from Building 213, which was a photo surveillance building for the CIA that these architects designed, and which the CIA claims to have no records of. They say, oh no, we don't have any drawings. There were no architects behind this. And obviously, you can see the building. It still exists. And all of the architects tell you all these stories. Oh, yeah, we had these drawings. We would erase the name of the building. We would fly to Washington, D.C., put the labels back on the drawings. But there are some meeting minutes, but everything is sort of redacted. So this idea of, like, how do you hold anyone accountable when you can't find any names, right? But also, as a case in point, I think, the most recent unveiling of the proposed White House ballroom attracted significant attention among architects and architectural critics. So people were up in arms at this proposal, calling out the excessive allocation of funds and the ridiculousness of the neoclassical style that was proposed by the lead design architect, McCrary Architects, which are a firm based in Washington, D.C. Yet behind this neoclassical veneer is AECOM. And while it might seem insignificant, it highlights the firm's embeddedness in federal, state, and local government, right? Today, in Los Angeles, as in many cities, mayors have partnered with large architecture and engineering firms like AECOM. So in LA, this was first to serve as the official infrastructure partner for the LA 28 Olympics, overseeing and managing all temporary event facilities. And most recently, the mayor's office hired AECOM to lead the long-term rebuilding efforts following the fires in the Palisades and Altadena. But importantly, they hired them all without a public call for qualifications or a competitive process for proposals, calling up their friends, as it were. And so what might these contracts mean for us as a profession? When we turn back to the history of AECOM and Dim Jim, we can remind ourselves of this process of international development that allows for such firms to build up expertise and capital, not only for us to understand how disaster capitalism works, but also how it fuels some of our largest architecture and engineering firms. So AECOM has designed power plants and urban infrastructure in countries all over the world, including in Russia. And following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the USAID hired AECOM as a, quote, reconstruction delivery partner to rebuild and repair cities in Ukraine. They even closed its Russian offices in an act of solidarity, explaining that the market volatility and financial losses in Russia could result in, quote, lower cash proceeds, right? There's always a financial mechanism there, right? So they're thinking on both ends. They're thinking about destruction, right? And then they're thinking about rebuilding. And they have contracts in both regards, right? So here, architecture is a very deliberate political act. And more recently, amid Israel's daily bombings of Palestine, AECOM began assembling a new team for reconstruction there too. This past summer, the company posted jobs for design managers for reconstruction in the West Bank and Gaza. And more recently, 2 weeks ago, the Washington Post leaked plans for reconstruction, assembled by the, quote, Great Trust, the Gaza Reconstitution, Economic Acceleration, and Transformation Trust. And so with detailed projections of $185 billion in annual revenue in its first 10 years, these plans are incredibly detailed. The plan includes massive highway infrastructure already, US electric car factories, and housing towers, designed and built by a global consortium of corporate sponsors from AECOM to IKEA to Tesla to Amazon. So rather than end on this heavy note, I'd like to end by returning to the somewhat naive question that we began with, which was, what is an architect, right? We have seen what work it is that architects can now do, which is anything, right? An expansive definition motivated primarily by profit and power. But we can hardly blame the young architects who started it all in this case, right? Architects who were simply trying to get by after growing up during a depression and trudging through war to design a successful business and support their families, right? So, and while this story of practice might offer a cautionary tale, and I hope it does, to young architects, right? In the book, I try to answer a bit more of a complicated question, which is who gets to decide? So since the middle of the 20th century, it's been the leaders of large corporate firms shaping, for the most part, the policies and rhetoric of our profession and our licensing and university accreditation bodies. Yet today, smaller firms still collectively outnumber larger firms. They outsize them in their command of billings, and they have the power when they come together to form unions, cooperatives, or join organizations that actively reimagine the profession outside of existing institutional structures and spheres of corporate influence. So as labor scholars like the late Jane McAlevey have argued, it's in the history of corporate organization, political corruption, and insider games that organizers for change can learn their most useful lessons. Thank you.
If you have questions, here is the microphone. Please, this is the most important part of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you.
Who want to start?
No pressure.
There.
My question is a bit more basic. I'm curious to know how long this took you to research and finalize your...
Yeah, great question. 500 years. No, no. I started in I think about 2014, and yeah, I've been working on it and just published the book this summer. So since then, so quite a long time. And I think the hard part is, like with 100,000 employees, a firm all over the world with hundreds and hundreds of projects, you could write dozens and dozens of books. So knowing when to stop and knowing when enough is enough is like an impossible question. But yeah, there's so much more to chew on. So if anyone's interested in kind of, I'll pass the baton. But yeah, a long time. But yeah, 2014 is about when I started. Yeah.
I had a question about how this model of, I guess when Dim Jim started, it married itself to the growth of the industrial or military-industrial complex, and it still is, especially what you referred to later with the images in Gaza, those renderings. I'm wondering how that process or that relationship has transformed in the 80 years, I guess, following World War II.
The structure of the firm itself, or?
I guess just like how, you're showing a lot of redacted documents and secrecy, and how they hide themselves. I know these things like change over time, and they're very like politically dependent, and situationally contextual. So like, I guess is it still, work for the military and then get out and then start an architecture firm and get military contracts, or has it changed into something else?
Yeah, in terms of like starting things, I think it's much more difficult for firms now because of the codes that they put in place, the laws and contracting policies, to start in this way. So when they were starting, there were no strict criteria about how to get a contract. This was called the Brooks Act. And so if you had friends in important places, you could get contracts. That's a little bit more difficult today, in part because they don't want other people, like they want to make sure that they can keep getting these contracts. So it's more difficult for firms to balloon in this exact way. So that's why we're kind of stuck with the relatively stagnant number of large firms that we have that just keep getting bigger, but the number and the quantity of the firms hasn't really changed very much. But I think one interesting thing, I mean, there are many things that have changed. One interesting thing, though, to pay attention to is how other firms, small firms that are not engaged in military work or not engaged in development work, have kind of mimicked these corporate firms as well. So one of the firms that I often have my students look at is Frank Gehry's office, which, at face value, we might think, oh, what in the world? They have nothing to do with firms like this, right? But actually, when you look at the practice, if you look up all the corporations, so we think of a firm as like one thing, right? An entity, a business. But if you look at how they're legally defined and legally organized, you'll see Gehry has so many corporations, right? Like this one is for textiles, this one's for the work in the Netherlands, this one's for wherever, right? Like they have different corporations for each of these different parts of their practice. And so it's in the design of, I think, the business that starts to show how similar they are, even if their projects are slightly different. And so the practices are similar, but their projects are different. But I think that requires us to not assume that we know the practice when we think of the projects. You know what I mean? So I would say that is maybe one of the biggest shifts, is that smaller firms are now operating in the same way, but through, with a kind of veil over in front of them in some sense. Yes.
So I'm just wondering about, just with reference to Frank Gehry and then that period of postmodernism, how do you see the correlation between the organizational diagram that emerged out of modernism? How do you see that informing more fragmented or more organic diagrams as being diagrams that are today's corporate structures in a similar way? Is there a correlation between those two? Does Frank Gehry's management structure look a bit like one of his buildings? Or is that, are they synonymous with one another in the way that they were initially? Yeah,
that's a good question. I don't know. I couldn't imagine what the diagram of Gehry's office looks like off the top of my head. I also, just to be transparent, in terms of like the last 10 or so years. This is like a historical study. I kind of fizzle out in the early 90s. So what has happened over the last decade or two, I'm not, like, I wouldn't know. I was always taught, don't speculate. But yeah, I think part of the difficult question is, like in these organizational diagrams that really produce postmodernism, there's an interest in kind of like holding the thing together with some level of connection, but also celebrating the fragments. And this is really where I think, Gary was part of this discourse, right? And so I think these buildings show that in some ways. Like you have to have some kind of curtain wall system that holds it all together, that looks like one thing. But at the same time, when you have many different organizations, or within one organization, you have to sort of celebrate that, like everyone wants to, like if you have a company that is selling sneakers and then selling, I don't know, microchips, like they don't have anything to do with each other. And so how do you then design something that can celebrate both of those things and see that they're fragmented, see that they're two different things, but also that they're part of one kind of thing? That is very postmodern, and I think, but I think these things are always cyclical, right? And I think right now we're back in the same kind of moment where we're thinking about the same kind of conversation. A lot of the terminologies about conglomeration and postmodern aesthetic, like it's all sort of back. But yeah, I mean, the moment we're talking about the surface, we're talking about like what is being hidden, what is behind. So yeah, but I think that whole discourse is very kind of integrated, thinking of Gary and Lumsden. I mean, they were all kind of friends and allies at that moment.
You talked a bit about how a lot of these structures were classified. I was just wondering how much you got to see the buildings. Was it good work, or did the firm, make shoddy buildings for the government?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the shoddy buildings are no longer standing. But part of the challenge I had was not so much accessing buildings, but accessing documents. And when I first went to AECOM, I was all excited, like, all right, I'm going to study you. And they were like, you? Like architecture? Why are you interested in studying us? And I was like, wait, what? Doesn't the A mean architecture? And they said, oh yeah, well, but we don't really do architecture, and But they didn't really even know. I mean, they don't know their own history that they were started by architects. But the access to documents was very hard. So they denied all my requests for access to drawing records, business record, any sort of record. So it was kind of difficult. I was like, had all these meetings for months and months and months with their attorneys. And they effectively said, oh, if we share any document, we're going to expose our clients, meaning the government, to liability. And so, but the nice thing is, when you're big like this, you leave paper trails everywhere. And so I would follow their records, like the CIA archives, the National Archives, all kinds of different places. And even the military, they keep really, really almost like the best records. The Army is the best. So I requested, for example, a ballistic missile, any drawings that they had for these ballistic missiles, these are Titan IIs, underground ballistic missile facilities. And the government was like, oh, sure, here's a full construction set. I was like, what? Like, so I have a whole construction set. So if anyone wants to build no, I'm just kidding. But like, so the things that they're just willing to, oh yeah, here you go. Like, there's no stake here. You're like, well, I guess you'd need a lot of money to be able to do it. But I mean, but meanwhile, these meeting minutes about like who's leaving to go to the restroom at what time, they're like, oh, we've got to be careful, right? So it was very, very difficult. But I also did a lot of oral histories with the people who were there early, like a lot of people who were like in their 90s, 95, 96, who remembered those early days and could kind of animate these stories. So buildings, it was not so hard. Documents, tricky, but yeah. And some of them were cool. Say what?
And were they good?
The buildings?
Yeah.
They had a moment, I think, like the 1960s and 70s, like when they hired Cesar Pelli and Anthony Lumsden, who were like really interested in design. They were really great. And they were winning so many awards. And still to this day, all of their projects are like really celebrated as great design. But then the company fired them because they were like, oh, you have too much power, and then it kind of declined. So the company about 10 years ago invested $1 million to try to figure out what the role of architecture is at AECOM now. They're like, what can architects do here? We don't know anymore. So it's like there's a kind of internal crisis of the role of the architect even internally, which is kind of comical because if only they studied their own history, they would have the answer.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.